While studying Slouching Towards Bethlehem and Kafka on the Shore, I noticed a clear thematic point that acknowledged our unknown reliance on collectivism and how that led to a dictation in our individual will. And this caused me to question, to what extent is our sense of individualism a product of our context and culture? Within the chosen passage for Slouching Towards Bethlehem, there is an emphasis on the cultural divide in the generations and how their social norms and their learned differences and their context of each other causes this divide, but ultimately discusses how the older generation is influenced by these norms and causes this negative connotation of the Haight-Ashbury, and thus how the Haight-Ashbury are fallen victim to this lack of individualism. This is represented with the inconsistent syntax in the first 8 lines, as there is a very abrupt change in that is utilized by Jillian to express how there is a lack of hold in the center and lack of clear structure, and shows the inconsistent view and recklessness of the Haight-Ashbury. In lines 1 through 3, the observers believe roughly what the children told them, that they were a generation dropped out of political action beyond power games, that the new left was just another ego trip. This clearly has pauses and a more clear structure in the syntax, but in lines 3 through 8, ergo, there were really no activists in the Haight-Ashbury, and those things which happened every Sunday were spontaneous demonstrations because, just as the diggers say, last comma in the sentence, the police are brutal and juveniles have no rights and runaways are deprived of their right to a self-determination and people are starving to death on Haight Street, comma, a scale model of Vietnam. I noted the commas because you notice that there is a lack of them, and the "and" that is used is represented also in the beginning of this short story, where Didion utilizes this to again represent the inconsistency and the recklessness, causing for a very rushed tone. And switching to juxtaposed diction, there is a shift fluidly because she does have experience with the Haight-Ashbury, but she is, as she notes, a part of this generation. And in lines 21 through 27, these were children who grew up cut loose from the web of cousins and great aunts and family doctors and lifelong neighbors who had traditionally suggested and enforced the society's values. These are children who moved around a lot. San Jose, Chula Vista here. They are less in a rebellion against the society than ignorant of it. Utilizing words like cut loose and naming, in San Jose, Chula Vista here, that is more like a call to her experience with the Haight-Ashbury, but there's a clear push and bias to the other side of the argument, the outside looking in, how they see them as children. That is a very reckless connotation that is brought up a lot in this passage, and how she calls them ignorant, less of a rebellion for society, and just ignorant of it. And she also uses the word "we" to note that she is not part of this Haight-Ashbury, and she is questioning their recklessness and how they did end up this way. But that also brings light to how she, as she acknowledged, is brought up by these societal norms, and thus her diction is influenced in this way. Bringing to her paradoxical logos, because the logic she is using in these last lines is very declarative and emphasizing the severity of falling in line with the group and not thinking for yourself, and allowing this, although it is going to happen anyways, this lack of individuality because you are a product of your context and culture. This is how they are waiting for the words to call to them. But as we see in lines 31 through 37, as it happens, I am still committed to the idea that the ability to think for oneself depends upon one's mastery of the language, and I am not optimistic about children. Break in sentence. They are 16, 15, 14 years old, younger all the time, an army of children waiting to be given the words. And to close with my global context and how this relates to Didion, she is ingrained with these societal norms as mentioned, and so that is affecting their stylistic literary choices, and thus how she is viewing them, which is very paradoxical because she is, and ironic because she is also addressing how these children are falling in line with this same thing that she is. As we move on to Kafka on the Shore, we'll discuss how Murakami combines literary techniques to emphasize the ingrained reliance on a false yet inescapable, universally applied narrative that drives our reading process. The first technique that he utilizes to address this is the intertext referencing that is a hallmark of not just this passage, but his entire book. Well, within this passage, the referencing in this dialogue sequence, quotes saying, "Dressing up like Colonel Sanders fits your character too, but I don't have a character or any feelings. Shape I may take, converse I may, but neither God nor Buddha am I. Rather an instance being whose heart thus differs from that of man. What the? A line from Udo Carney's Tales of Moonlight and Rain. I doubt you've read it. You got me there." Not only are we hearing this dialogue from the iconic Western character that is Colonel Sanders, which brings a very along with the dialogue, which we will get into, is ironic, but also he is in his self an intertextuality character, but is also bringing up more outside literature with Moonlight and Rain. This irony and this narrative insertion that Murakami is using is in a way showing this mirror to us, because we are so reliant on intertextuality, and this is just one way that Murakami acknowledges how, as a whole, we are dictated by certain ways that influence our analysis and comprehension process. As we move to explanatory dialogue, the Western icon Colonel Sanders is explaining to this other character, Hoshino is ultimately an insertion of the reader and allows for almost a reprieve of the reader, but to have someone in the story that is acknowledging the absurdity of things that happen in a magic realist world. In lines 17 through 24, I'm not sure I follow, but what you're saying is you're not a person and not a god or Buddha either, right? Neither God nor Buddha, just the incidents. As much of the God and bad, good and bad of man, I neither inquire nor follow. Meaning, since I'm neither God nor Buddha, I don't need to judge whether people are good or evil. Likewise, I don't have to act according to standards of good and evil. This again showing this mirror to us, but in a way that is forcing us to read something that we would usually make this inference about a character and these references to gods and Buddhas in a way that is not directly shown to us, something that Murakami is playing with. And we see, as Hoshino is asking, I'm not sure I follow, and meaning he is attempting to understand and unlearn this ingrained way of seeing this traditional grand narrative that we all do. So when you read a magic realism alone and postmodernism is breaking this narrative, but this is taking it to the next level to where we really are causing to look inward and reflect on how we are just a product of what we have seen in this inescapable narrative that even Murakami cannot not acknowledge in a story. And then lastly, the logic that makes up this logos is the Colonel Sanders discussing what Murakami is trying to bring, and because Hoshino is the reader's insertion, he does have a certain questioning and trying to bring logic as we are to this book, but Colonel Sanders takes over in the last few lines. The technical term for it is abbreviating sensory processing of continuous information, but I don't want to get into all that. It'd take too long to explain, and I know it's beyond you, so let's cut to the chase. Within those, in that last paragraph of this passage, he is outright explaining to us and laying it all on the table, which is ironically confronting us, because again we have to look at this mirror. And These acknowledges from both authors bring light to how my global issue, whether it is two separate groups or us as a whole, what makes us look to literature in a certain way. It allows for a thorough insight as we continue to acknowledge us as these authors have, and to navigate ourselves and others.